Welcome to the panel room. My name is Jason Tongier, and I'll be your moderator today. This panel is all about short stories and the value of persistence. But before we get into that, let's go around the room and let everyone know a little about yourself and what you bring to the world of short stories. Go ahead and start with Michele.
Hi everyone, I'm Michele Berger and I write science fiction, fantasy. I would say that everything I write has an element of horror and psychological horror. And I just finished, my latest project is a novella that was published by Falstaff Books, which is about an epidemic that starts in the 1990s through an everyday hair care product affecting first Black and Latino communities. So I wrote it a long time ago, so I can talk a lot about persistence when we get there. But, yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
All right, and Nicole.
I'm Nicole Givens Kurtz. I write weird westerns, science fiction, mysteries, and horror. I also am the owner and publisher of Mocha Memoirs Press, and our mission is to amplify marginalized voices in speculative fiction. So I can speak from both sides of the coin in regards to writing short fiction and also publishing short fiction. We do a number of anthologies. Our most recent one that we just finished a call for is Slay, which are stories from the vampire noir.
Okay, great. And then Gail.
Hi, I'm Gail Z Martin and Morgan Bryce. As Gail Z Martin, I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, steampunk, near future, post-apocalyptic adventures, and a whole lot more. And then as Morgan Bryce, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. I've had short stories in over 40 US and UK anthologies. Mm-hmm. And some of those short stories have taken me in completely unexpected career directions. So that's something that I never would have thought or expected, but it definitely has made a huge impact on my career.
Okay, great. And Jean Marie.
Hi, I'm Jean Marie Ward. I write fiction, nonfiction, and everything in between. On the short story front, I've published over 30 short stories and everything from Asimov's to the anthologies of Zombies Need Brains. I will write in any genre people pay me for. And my path to publication on both globally and individual short stories is weird, as you might expect.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Nicole, what was the first short story that you wrote or published?
Okay, so the very first short story I wrote, I was in the 9th grade. It was about a Thanksgiving event in my neighborhood. So, and even then I was a big Stephen King fan. So it had lots of horror elements, the turkey actually attacking people. And yeah, it was loads of fun. And it was written on spiral paper with all the little edges, right? And it was this thick. That's the first short story I actually wrote out. I remember 9th grade, heavily influenced by Stephen King there. But the first story I wrote, and actually later on I cleaned it up in college and actually won a fiction award for it after I cleaned it up a lot after many creative writing classes. But that's my very first short story, but I knew immediately that this was something that I wanted, that I enjoyed doing, right? Is writing short fiction.
Okay. And Gail, how about yourself?
Well, I've always written stories since the time I was a kid. And the first one that I kind of tried to tell, I had to have my grandmother write it down for me because I couldn't spell yet. I was 5 or 6. It was about a vampire because I was a huge fan of Dark Shadows. So go figure, not much has changed. Still writing about vampires. Arguably, I can spell better. That's up for debate. Ask my editors. But the first published short story was in an anthology called Rum and Runestones, and I'd never written a short story before. I was writing epic fiction that was coming in around 175,000 words, 600 pages, and I only did it because a friend asked me, because it frankly terrified me to write a story that was under 8,000 words when I'd been writing such huge, Chihuahua killer books. And the story turned out pretty well. I was happy with it. It had to have magic and pirates in it. And then other things came about, and that world got expanded. But yeah, that turned into quite a thing.
Okay. Jean Marie?
Well, I cannot say that I started writing short fiction. My first story that, well, it wasn't really a story, it was a play that was produced in 3rd grade. It was The Theft of Thor's Hammer. I played Loki. I probably should tell you everything you need to know about me. Did not write short stories again until 1990s, when everybody said, oh, you need to write short stories to get published. It didn't work. And then wrote a couple art books, wrote a novel with a friend. Friend died, and I had to suddenly learn how to write fiction. And that was when I started really writing short stories seriously, was to teach myself how to do all the things in fiction that my co-writer used to do. She had structure, she had plot. I had a lot of pretty words. And so the short fiction was a way to learn how to do all the things I needed to do to craft a cohesive story that somebody would actually be interested in reading. Hopefully, it worked.
Okay. And Michele?
So I feel like my story is a little bit similar to Jean Marie's in that I actually always wanted to write novels, and I got into, in the late 90s, into the Clarion Science Fiction Fantasy Writers Workshop when it was still at Michigan State. And the goal there is to produce a series of short stories. And although I really enjoyed that experience, I never came out with any. I came out with basically half novels and novellas. And so for years, I just was like, well, I'm not a short story person. But like Jean Marie, the thinking at the time was that you build your career by writing short stories. And short fiction does teach you a kind of an attention to language and structure in a way that large pieces don't. So consequently, it took me, I think in the last, I would say 8 years, to really study short fiction like I had studied novels. And my first published piece was for an anthology. And I sent the piece in. It was stories told in the second person, which I know will make some people out there think, why would anyone write an anthology on that? But actually, it was a really cool anthology. And when I first pitched the story to them, or sent the story to them, they liked it, but it was too long. And so I said, will you give me an opportunity to revise it? Which I always say, if an editor gives you any kind of toe in the door, go all the way in. And so I just worked on it. And I think that was like 750 words. I think I submitted something like 2,000 words, but it was the first time and they accepted it. And it was the first time I thought, okay, I can do this, but it doesn't come as easy. And I really feel like I have to work on it. And that's something, I just think that comes with more writing over time in terms of short fiction, and studying a lot of different kinds of writers who write short fiction.
Okay. And Gail, for the next question, what was the longest amount of time for you for a story from writing it to publication?
I kind of cheated on this one because I didn't start trying to write short stories until after I had a number of books published, and friends of mine who were editing anthologies asked me to be in anthologies. So I wasn't writing something on spec or trying to pitch it to send out. I was very fortunate. And that meant I just had to write and have it done by the deadline. So that's kind of a different experience. I didn't have something in the trunk that I was trying to send, trying to get a home for. I was writing to a prompt for an anthology I already knew I was going to be in. And that's kind of a different thing. So, depending on the length of the story, I've gotten faster at it over time, but, probably took about, a couple of weeks close to a month in the first round, and under pressure with a gun to my head, yeah, I can get it done now in like, less than a week, if needs must when the devil drives. But it definitely gets easier with practice.
Okay, Jean Marie, same question.
Well, this gets into the whole
You got a
persistence
story.
thing. That's a dangerous question with me, because I've got stories that gestated for over a decade. One of the stories in the 1990s that I submitted to a magazine was a story about a tantric sorceress, and there was telepathy involved. Sent it off to somebody. I got back the notice. This obviously, you don't know anything about telepathy. Nobody knows anything about telepathy because, hello, it's a fantasy. Yeah, that part. Secondly, I was the initial public affairs officer for the Stanford Research Institute experiments in parapsychology conducted for the Department of Defense in the 1980s. So if anybody knew anything about how telepathy worked and had the unclassified documentation to prove it, it was yours truly. But that kept getting rejected until I figured out that what they didn't like was I had somebody making a comment sarcastically, and nobody realized it was sarcasm. Okay, fast forward 10 years, a call goes out for stories about lesbian sorceresses. And so I dropped this, happened to have a lesbian couple in it. So I sent the story in, and it was accepted within an hour of the closing of the submission period. Literally, it was accepted in the first hour. And so that anthology, Hellebore and Rue, went on to be nominated by ALA as one of their major LGBTQ titles for the year. It won an award. ALA basically said it was one of the things, it was one of the recommended titles. There were several other LGBTQ awards that it won. And I think that it was when the initial publisher went out of business, Lethe Press picked it up and kept it in print for years. Then there was the other story, which the anthology that Gail mentioned, Rum and Runestones, I was invited to participate. Well, my story was rejected. Okay, I rewrote it. And at the end of 2016, that story was accepted. Okay, so 8 years, not quite 10. But the publisher of that magazine went out of business 10 months later. So I'm still trying to sell the story that was already accepted and I have a contract for, but never got paid because the contract was pay on publication, not on pay on acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then there's another one, but that's enough for me.
All right, thank you. And Michele, how about yourself?
So the shortest story I've ever written that got published was 100 words. There's this great online journal called 100 Word Story, and that took me basically a week to write. The longest time, I would say, is the anthology that the four of us are in, which is Warriors and Wise Women. I had started a story in the 1990s when I was a graduate student, and I could never, it was sort of this young woman. I had a character. I always start with a character. She's in a cemetery. She hears voices. And I knew it was sort of a post-apocalyptic setting, but I could never quite finish it. So I always had like 5,000 words. Well, when I got invited to this anthology a couple of months ago, I was like, okay, I know I can do something with the story. And so that, I just feel like it's so important. I always believed in the character. And I feel like if you believe in the character or the setting, and it speaks to you over time, to keep working with it. And so that that came out to be 10,000 words. Jason's being quite lenient. I like broke through maybe 10,800 words. So persistence really does, pay off, and keep thinking about your stories and how they evolve.
Great. And Nicole?
So my shortest story, I think it's like 1,200 words, and it's Lipstick Smiles, which is for a podcast for Michelle. I just lost it. The podcast. It's light.
Yeah,
she's gonna kick my butt because I can't remember what it is. But so yeah, that was the shortest thing that I've written and actually had published. But so the longest, I had a story that I had started right after I got out of high school, and about a young man living in, it's actually, I grew up in a housing project, and I have a large family, a large extended family, and much of my extended family also lived in various housing projects throughout my hometown. And in every time I went to visit one of them, there's always a candy lady, someone who sells candy and snacks and pop or soda or Coke out of their house. And so that story sat with me for 12 years, 13 years. I could never get it finished. Like Michelle, I could see the character, I could see the premise very clearly. I just couldn't get it read, couldn't get it done. And then John Hartness had a call for The Big Bad Volume 2. And he was like, hey, Kurtz, you got a story for this? And I was like, oh man, I want to do that. And so I actually sat down and was like, this is why I couldn't get this story written, because I was looking at this character from a very positive protagonist view, but he's actually the big bad is himself, right? So he's both the protagonist and the big bad, spoiler. And so I wrote it and was able to finish it and get it published. So, and submit it to John, and he did accept it. So that took about, 15 years? So yeah, that was the longest.
Okay.
Well, but there's a thread that you knew John was waiting for it, just like I knew Jason was waiting for it. So there is a sense of when you're just writing something to then try to submit to a venue, that's really different than you have relationships with the editors who, and I had not worked with Jason before, and I was like, I don't want to disappoint him, and everyone else has their story done, and I know you all were super amazing. So I was like, the pressure. But
okay, so the name of the story is Lipstick Smiles, and you can get it on, it's called God darn it, I just had it, it's Nightlight.
Okay, yeah.
It's a Nightlight horror podcast for people of color, but all the stories are horror in origin, and they're all written by people of color, so you should definitely check that out.
And Michelle, you're talking about Jason Graves?
Yes.
Just to clarify.
Yes. Jason Graves. Yeah. Perspective Press.
Yep. So yeah, that's one of the things, right? It's like when I get stories, we just finished this big call for submissions for vampire stories, and the limit is 5,000 words. But I have had so many people write me and go, can I send 10 like Michelle, or can I go over 500
Nicole.
words?
I won't do that. I'm not going to do that.
I had someone who sent it, was like, I have 15,000 words. Look, no, that's just 5,000 words. And we can give or take it right around it, right? But that's an extra 10,000 words. Where do I put that in comparison to all the other stories, right? So, but definitely like Michelle said, and I think everyone has said so far on this panel, I keep that box of your babies, a file of all your attempts, or all the things you don't finish, or all the things I keep things that I cut out, right?
Yeah.
And just hold them, because they're actually like seeds, and you can plant them to either grow new stories or to put them back in the same world building ground and let them blossom into adjacent stories. So it's really helpful to maintain an area on your flash drive. I actually don't recommend flash drives, in Dropbox or OneDrive or somewhere where you can house your seeds. And that's kind of what I do in regards to all of my fiction.
Okay, great. Jean Marie.
Yep.
Anytime you start out in a new field, which I know none of you guys are starting out in a new field now, but when you do, it can be difficult to get your foot in the door. Were there any moments like that with short stories for you that you had to
Yes,
overcome?
yes and no. Okay. I had written nonfiction and published nonfiction for years. And my first short story sale was actually through a friend. The thing that I find most frustrating is the fact that even when you have a relationship with people, you know them through something else. Well, it's not frustrating, but something you don't expect is that you can be friends with people, you can love each other dearly, and they still won't buy your stuff, you know? And you always, at least I do, submit to friends with a kind of heart in the throat thing, because you're afraid that when you put this object in the mail, it's going to ruin the friendship if they don't like it. And there are people who, well, let's just face it, no matter how good your story is, if it does not either fit the editor's mindset for the magazine, the anthology, whatever the market is, or your voice is not to their taste, it's not going to go anywhere. And all of that stuff is really kind of hard to learn, and really very, very, if you are depressive by nature, I'm not, but if you have feelings of insecurity and a tendency towards depression, the fact that you could throw something at a market and you think that it is perfectly suited to your market, and you could keep throwing it and it won't fly. And it may not be the fault of the story. It may be that you are not a good fit for that market. And I think that that was the hardest thing to learn, even though, you know, I had been selling nonfiction. I sold bits and pieces over the years, but I'm only within the past 5 years, and my career in fiction and nonfiction is longer than some of these folks, some of the folks on this panel have been alive, that there are markets that you will never sell to because your voice is not a good fit for that market. And then there are markets you will sometimes sell to, but there are circumstances beyond your control that will mean your story is not going to make the grade. And that was the hardest thing to learn for me.
Okay, great. Michele.
Can you repeat the question, just please?
Just getting your foot in the door, anything you had to overcome, and it could be anything in writing, doesn't have to be short stories.
Yeah, and thank you for repeating the question. I was really paying a lot of attention to what Jean Marie says, because I feel like that really encapsulates a lot of what I experience. I also think the market is different. So I started submitting somewhat haphazardly in the late 90s, early 2000s. And granted, I was an uneven writer, and I was pitching, novel ideas and short stories. But I think separate from the effort of doing it and trying to find the right market and reading, for a lot of people of color, I just think that at that time in the 90s and early 2000s, some certain kinds of work was just not as well, people were not as open or accepted. It was just a different market. So having said that, I feel like I really experienced part of that compression. And now it's really different, which is amazing. And obviously I feel like I'm a much stronger writer. So I'm just doggedly persistent. So I just kept going. And I think for me too, it's also trying to do the the flash fiction, which is a palate cleanser, than the longer works, right? Then especially like 10,000 word stories or even novellas. So I feel like I've gotten more adept at trying to do that sweet spot, which is, as Nicole was saying earlier, that 2,000, 3,000, because that's also just a better fit for a lot of markets. So I think it's believing in yourself, and also going back to Robert Heinlein's The 10 Rules of Writing too, like keep sending your work out, don't revise unless an editor, I think don't be extreme with reading those rules, because some things have changed since Heinlein was writing, but I do think, getting feedback, but believing in the story. And a resource that I found helpful the last couple of years is Nancy Kress's Beginning, Middles, and Endings, which is an excellent book just in terms of like, some of us are stronger at the beginning and not so strong in the middle, or, so that book was really helpful to me.
Okay, great. Nicole.
All right, so what I also started writing professionally. I've been doing this for about 25 years. So I think my first novel had its first contract in '98. But it was a small press. It was not the glorious, established New York publisher that I wanted for that title. And I'm actually thankful today that it was not, because it's a horrible book. It just wasn't ready. And like Michele was saying, I was a very new writer in that regard to long form. I'd written a ton of short stories, but the long form, the novel was that it's very, just going back on it now, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is atrocious. Who would accept this? But I think too, being reflective about your work, continuing to learn about your craft, those things are important in terms of growing as a writer. And then also in terms of like being able to look at your work and say, yeah, that's not a good piece of work. And being able to tell this is a good piece of work, right? But I also found in terms of like submitting a lot of challenges, because those gatekeepers were like, I've told this story before, that I was at my first convention with my first novel, and people were not very receptive to an African-American woman writing fiction at all. They were like, what is she doing in here? And it was a very alienating situation. However, fast forward 20 years, right? And you have like whole conventions dedicated to Black speculative fiction, right? So it's a very different world and universe, and the opportunities abound. And so we evolve, and so does and your craft should evolve, and so does fandom evolves, and writing evolves. So as those things continue to change, just stay plugged in, right? Or stay knowledgeable, practice your craft. Don't get tunnel vision, and it's really easy to do that, to just get stuck in your own writing tunnel, right? Without reaching out, without read. Oh my God, read. Read. It always makes my hair like, it's already pretty spiky, but it always like curls tighter when I hear authors say I don't have time to read. I'm sorry, what? Read. That's part of it. And so these are all the things that I had to learn haphazardly, right? Because I was just, fumbling forward through the dark. But I actually was able to go to conventions and network with people who were able to say and learn, right, about the craft of writing, and being able to expand and develop my own writing enough to, and read. In reading, of course, I read submissions, but I also read other people's work that I respect and that I think, oh my God, I'm never gonna be able to write as awesome as Gail Martin. So yeah, those are my suggestions, right, on my journey. Just be persistent and make sure you learn and be reflective about your craft.
All right, that sounds great. And now let's go to Gail. Now, like you said, you started short stories, luckily, as an anchor author,
Yes.
rather than having to submit. But what have you had to overcome?
Well, at the time I wrote the first short story, like I said, my contracts called for a minimum of 175,000 words. I could go over that, but I couldn't go under it. And so getting told, you got to keep it under 8,000 words for a whole story that had to have a beginning, middle, and end, and wasn't just a chapter, just seemed daunting. And so I was kind of terrified, but Valerie Griswold Ford asked me to do it, and she's a good friend. And I said, okay, I'm not promising this is going to be worth anything, but I'll do it. And what I've come to realize since then is that one of the differences between one of those big fat fiction epic fantasies and a short story is if you imagine being a TV director, it's the difference between a close-up and a long shot. So with the epic fantasy, you'll have a long shot to tell a story that involves the whole world and multiple viewpoints and periods of time and lots of different interbraided plots. And with a short story, you've got that tight focus where you might have the whole thing happening in a day or a couple of days, and there's only one person who's a point of view character. And so you're in there tight on it, and that helps you learn where to start the story, because the story can't have that kind of scope. At least mine don't. Other people perhaps can wrap entire worlds in 5,000 words, and I'm sure they do. Mine don't tend to go that way. So I have to really ratchet that focus in closely. And I think the short stories that I've read that have made the biggest impact on me have also been a very tight focus like that. So I think that was the hardest thing, was learning that it was really a matter of changing where you put the camera, so to speak, on the different projects that you were doing. And then novellas are kind of in the middle.
Okay, that sounds good. Now,
Can
I know Jean. Yeah,
Can
go
I
ahead.
just add one other, can I just follow up from Gail's point too, that one of the things that one of my writing teachers said that really helped me, she was talking about short fiction as a dinner party, right? And like you get people together and there's all this thing and then it ends. And what I realized, the thing that I was doing wrong, I was like, oh, I'm actually writing sleepovers. Like they just go on and they have breakfast together, you know, like, so like that sense of what Gail was saying was about scope, I think is really, really, really important and hard to learn except by practicing it.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Now, I know that Jean Marie has submitted to magazines as well. Have you guys, anyone else done magazines? Okay, then I'll start with you, Nicole. What do you see as, obviously there's a difference between submitting to a magazine and an anthology and pros and cons of it?
Well, pros, one of the cons is that there aren't very many magazines anymore. So that's one thing. And there are actually many more anthology, right, like call for submissions. So one of the other differences between the two is pay, right? So if you get enough professional paying magazines, there's not a lot of those anymore either, but the pay is always different, right? So for an anthology, you might get a percentage of the sales versus a per word payment. So that's a difference too. Usually the per word works out better, but it depends on how much per word you're getting, whether you're getting token amounts or whether you're getting like professional rates. So I submit to both. I also, like for my stories that don't fit a theme or are not built around a particular call, those I send out to magazines, right? Because they don't have to, it's just a story that it's a horror story, it's a horror magazine, they might like it. Whereas if it's an anthology, it's usually around a particular theme or statement or world, and you have to like write a story that acquiesces to those requirements. So those are the big differences between magazine and anthology submissions. And I do submit to both.
Okay. Michele, have you submitted to any magazines or?
Submit to, like Nicole, I submit to both. And I feel like I've been trying to work my way and consciously sort of up the ladder of, you know, semi-pro, pro in terms of magazines. Because I still think, you know, even though there are fewer magazines, a lot of people in traditional publishing tend to read, you know, some of the major, you know, Asimov's magazine of fantasy and science fiction, you know, the bigger, and Faya, which is a wonderful magazine, Black speculative fiction. But the other thing I do also is I submit to contests and have had some success. Sometimes contests will, if you place, then they publish So that is kind of another vehicle for people that can be helpful, and looking for contests that that are open or no fee or low fee, I think ideally. Or, you know, sometimes it's also, when you think about contests, it's also thinking about the judges and the respect of the judges, and do you want those judges to read your work? So even if it's a fee, is it sort of worth that? And what's the winning? So, but contests can be also a way to kind of help people to submit.
Great. Gail.
I haven't written for magazines. I have written for a really strange spectrum of anthologies. And so that's just kind of a different thing. Part of it was that I was already doing books by the time I realized I could actually write a short story, and there were deadlines. And so doing some of those other things on spec just didn't fit with the realities of the deadlines I already had to meet. So I didn't throw my hat in that particular ring. But I think the biggest thing for me is realizing that a short story can end up taking you places you never expected to go. So when I was writing the Chronicle series for Solaris Books, and actually I had left them to go with Orbit, and they kind of wanted me back. And so I got invited to be in an anthology, Magic, the Esoteric and Arcane. And the editor sent me an email saying, now, this is all about real magic. And the strange thing about my life is I knew what he meant, in that he didn't mean the Gandalf with the lightning coming out of his fingertips. They wanted urban fantasy. So the story that I wrote for him ended up being set in Charleston, South Carolina, about a woman who could read the history and magic of objects by touching them. And he came back to me and said, do you want to, we'd really like you to do a series based on the characters in this short story. And the answer to that is always yes. And that has become one of my best-selling series, the Deadly Curiosities series. And that very first story that I sold to Rum and Runestones, which was set back around the Revolutionary period, about a guy who deals with some pirates and a magical cursed object and all of that, he ends up being an ancestor of the main character in Deadly Curiosities. And he has now come back to be a recurring ghostly character in the last two Deadly Curiosities stories, as well as two of my urban fantasy Morgan Bryce's that overlap. So I never would have expected that to happen, but here we are. And so a story can take you all kinds of places and open all kinds of doors. So anytime you get a chance to write one, write it.
Definitely. Jean Marie.
Well, the thing is, I have had some success submitting directly to magazines and sold some things. And I tend to think that the pool of magazines is about the same as it always was. It's just in a different place. You don't have a hell of a lot of magazines in Barnes and Noble, and there aren't really any newsstands outside of New York. So you don't see those kinds of magazines anymore. But there are a lot of magazines, webzines. I would even argue that certain podcasts like Podcastle and Escape Pod are themselves magazines, only their content is verbal. It's all designed to be read or performed. But I think that there are more anthologies than there used to be, and that might be the thing. But oddly enough, most of my best magazine sales have been stories rejected by anthologies. And it's, you know, this gets back to the theme of this panel. It's persistence. Yeah, I've done Over the Transom with things like Akashic Books and wound up in their Mondays or Murder several years ago. But the story I did for Asimov's was never intended for Asimov's. It was for an anthology. I had been pursued by the editor to write I was not an anchor author for this anthology. I'd been pursued, however, by the editor to write something for the anthology. I said, well, what about this? And he said, yeah, that's great, write it. I wrote it and I got the rejection back. This doesn't meet the specs, the specifications. I've got, I asked you about that. Well, I basically put it in a drawer, and I do believe that sometimes distance gives you a better idea of a story, that you can revise it even without having specific input from an editor. So I looked at it, and yeah, I twiddled with it. I strengthened it in some places. And then I sent it out to a series of magazines. And I take the opposite tack from Michele. I start at the top. I'll start at like fantasy and science fiction and then go down. I looked for everything that was either urban fantasy or sci-fi that could be near future, because it was a sci-fi story that was set in the present. Well, rejected. The two markets I did not try were analog and Asimov's, because hell's hard sci-fi, they are never ever going to take that. And finally, I was just getting ready to send it out again, and somebody put forward a notice from Sheila Williams saying, hello, Asimov's does interstitial fiction as well as hard sci-fi. If you think it doesn't go anyplace else, try us. And I did. And I got back a revise and resubmit letter, which is, we like this story, but we aren't going to publish it like it is right now. And she wrote very kind words and suggested that she would like to see more in certain areas of the story. Well, you better believe I dropped everything to revise that story. Unfortunately, the revision took a 7,500 word story to 12,000 words. I thought, never, ever going to take this, but what the hell? I need the extra 5,000 words to do all the things she wanted me to do. And then I sent it off. And then after having sent it off, I find in an interview with Sheila Williams from someplace else that if she says revise and resubmit, big secret, folks, she'll take the story even if you don't revise it, because she likes the voice, which gets back to, if they like your voice, you're golden. If they don't like your voice, just forget about it, give it up. And she accepted it. She liked the changes, and the story wound up being, and this was my first appearance in Asimov's, and to date my only one, and it wound up being one of the top 5 stories in its category for the year. So, you know, in terms of anthology versus magazine or magazine versus anthology, my experience is a bit different than most folks. It's like the stuff that the anthology editors don't like generally winds up being perfect for the magazines. Go figure.
All right, thank you so much. Now, I've got a question to start with Gail. Darren Kennedy, this kind of goes back to something that you've touched on before, that we've touched on before. What are your thoughts on low paying or no pay for exposure? And
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on where you are and what you want out of the experience. I have done a share of anthologies for contributor copies, and that's usually because a friend asked me, or because I was asked and the theme was interesting and I wanted to play. I've made decent money off other stories, not as much as I, have heard tell of other people making in other markets. But I was happy enough with it. I don't look at my anthologies, at least the kind that I have been participating in, as being money makers. I'm thrilled when I get a check. There are also a couple of them that routinely send me a check for like $1.75 every quarter. That's okay. Because of anthologies, I have met a lot of other authors and gotten to know them. I've met a lot of editors. I have learned the craft in different ways. I've taken risks. I've gotten invited to write another whole series. And I've gotten to be in anthologies with some of my personal heroes. There was one of the ones that came out this year, Across the Universe from Fantastic Books, is an alternative Beatles anthology of what the Beatles would be if they weren't rock gods. Okay, that is so far out of my wheelhouse, because most of the time, the way the anthology thing has paid me is that I generally try to write a story in one of my established universes, so when it reverts, I can put it out in my own collection or put it up on Amazon for pay, and then some of those pay very well. This one I'm looking at, you know what? This is my chance to be in an anthology with Spider Robinson.
Oh, mm-hmm.
One of my childhood teenage favorites. But I'm not going to pass that up. And so, in mine, of course, the Fab Four ended up being more like the Scooby Gang. But because, of course, they did. That's what I write. But that was because I wanted my name in a table of contents with Spider Robinson. So for me, it's kind of a fun thing. I just am doing a charity anthology on my Morgan Bryce side of things. Of course, that's not going to earn me any money whatsoever from the anthology. And it was all prompt driven. So they put out a spreadsheet to readers and said, pick one from column A, one from column B, describe the main characters, describe pick their names, pick their location, pick some of these attributes about them. And then they turned it back to the authors and said, okay, pick the pieces you want to put your story around. It had to be a paranormal romance. So I have just turned in a story about a squirrel shifter who falls in love with a guy who is terrified of squirrels. And they also both write fan fiction. Okay. But I had so much fun writing it. So some of it is also, and I got to be in an anthology with some authors that I really respect, and I was thrilled to be asked to do it. So there are all kinds of reasons to be in anthologies. Okay. And people have found my work and followed me home to the other books from stories that I didn't initially get paid for.
Okay. Nicole, how about yourself?
So like Gail, I have written things for contributor copies. I've written things for charity anthologies. Again, it's very much, you're not going to make your living on short fiction, right? So you're not going to be able to make a living just writing short fiction. They just don't pay enough. And so you have, when I write short fiction, when I send things off, it's usually for one of those two reasons. Like Gail said, I'm writing a story in my Sybil Lewis universe that's a mystery, right? And I want people to find and discover and be introduced to Sybil, right? And so her to find new readers and new fans. Or it's something that's completely interesting, like a Weird Western that I absolutely love. They don't have, that I get to write and about the other people in the West, about my love for New Mexico, right? And so I get to do those things in a story, and even though it may not pay a lot, or it may not pay at all, it gives you an opportunity to take risks, to have fun, to engage in something unique and different, just to see if I can like write a story about that. And so yeah, you can write for exposure or for contributor copies or for no money. There's definitely value in that. But definitely don't try to like support a family on your short fiction sales.
All right, Jean Marie.
Yeah, sorry, I had to unmute myself. I think I did now. Yep. Yeah, it depends. I agree with both Nicole and Gail that why you write for anthologies, whether or not they have, or any venue, um, you don't have to write for money to advance your career. You can write for something because you do need the exposure. If you're going through a completely dry spell and you just want to have a publication credit that you can use later, that's a valid reason. I tend to try to avoid markets that don't pay unless there's something in it for me or something in it for somebody else. A charity anthology, which is run by somebody whose knowledge of business and their knowledge of monetizing and making a profit and actually getting the money they make to the charity, yeah, that's good. Because like Gail said, you can wind up with some of your childhood or your teenage heroes in the anthology. Or if you've got something that is really too weird to place anyplace else, sometimes low pay anthologies will have a prompt that gives you something that you really want to work to, and suddenly you've got an idea and you're off to the races, and you know it's not going to sell anyplace else, so you might as well do it. But I'm very, very hesitant about markets, even markets who pursue you, who are talking about what a wonderful experience it will be for you to give them free fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much. I mean, I had this actually happen to me. I got this request to participate in a contest that was going to create an anthology, and they wanted my work. And oh, by the way, only the top 3 were getting paid, and number 3 was only getting $25. And it was like, it takes me a long time to write. I am a slow writer, not like the rest of the folks here. So it was like, good luck with that contest. Thank you very much for the invite. And they kept coming after me. Well, don't you want to be in this anthology? Well, no. There's nothing there for me. There's only something there for you to say that you have a host of published writers in your anthology that you're not paying anybody for. No, no. If it was something that was important to me or fulfilled a goal or let me be in a table of contents that I, really wanted to be in. Oh my God, my name's next to Neil Gaiman, or my name is next to Charlaine Harris. Yeah, baby. But I'm the biggest name in that thing, and you're not a friend I owe a favor to, or you're not a friend that I want to help out. No.
All right, Michele.
So I think it's interesting because different areas of writing have slightly different ideas about what works and what doesn't work. I also write creative nonfiction and some more realistic / sort of literary fiction. And, in literary journals, no one gets paid. Usually in poetry journals, no one gets paid. And there's not an expectation. So it's really interesting. I agree with what everyone has said. And I think for me, I am trying to really target pro markets, semi-pro and pro markets, and keep doing that, as well as, though, the wonderful thing is that now, having kind of a broader literary community, I'm getting asked to be in anthologies. And so that's really been rewarding because it's like building relationships with writers, as everyone said, and editors. I think it's respecting the venue. So if you decide to go with a magazine that is smaller, not well known, but you love the writing, that's the other thing, you love what they're publishing, you love what the editors are doing, that's okay. And I think it depending on where you are in your career. So it's not I try not to make these really hard and fast rules, but I am more targeting the pro markets and also getting, invited or trying to get into anthologies where, I want to work with a particular editor. And as everyone said, we're not going to, make a lot of money from short fiction, but it can lead to other things.
Okay. Now, I do have one final question before we go around with everyone, and I might be putting you a bit on the spot, but I'll start with Nicole. Misty Massey asked this question. I really want to hear from everyone about it. Is there a short story that, as she says, completely rocked your world? Something that you love, you may go back to, or just
Oh
something.
my goodness. I have like a list. So I taught English for 20 years. So I have a list of short stories that rock my world. So one of the things that actually tears me up is what tore me up as a child is the girl with the green silk ribbon around her neck. Like, whoa, that one. As a horror writer at heart, that just blew me out the water. So the yellow wallpaper, of course. Anything by Ambrose. It's an incident at some bridge. I can't remember the exact name of it, but that one really messed me up because it was an unreliable narrator, and it is, you don't know that initially until the end, and so it's very it taught me a lot about one, about an unreliable narrator, and about how you can actually use words and story to play with time, which was really great. So I know these are really old stories, but these are the short stories that kind of blew me out of The Lottery by Shirley Jackson. It was another one that long before Midsummer, right? You have this modern day group of people just, hey, we have to do this thing, get your number, and if you get this black dot, we're going to stone you to death. Like, it was very chilling in that it was something very archaic and old, set in this very modern everyday town. And so that was kind of unnerving, and it was my first experience with something like that wasn't like a Chihuahua Killer Stephen King novel, right? It was this compact, hitch in the gut story. And so I teach short fiction. One of Alice Walker's stories, I can't think of the name of it.
So many good ones.
Yes, but there's one that just because of my relationship with my mother, just kind of swept me off my feet, because it's about a mother and a daughter, and a daughter that stays home and a daughter that goes away to college, and I can't think of the name of it. But it was,
I know which one you're talking about.
I love that story. Like, I can't think of the name. Like, and look, y'all, it's way past. It's 10 o'clock. I'm old.
It's something with quilting. It's something with quilting. Quilting.
Yes.
Okay,
but it is something about quilting. Oh my gosh, I love that story, and it just, again, it's another emotional punch to the gut in its relationship to moms and daughters. And so, especially Black mom and daughters. So that was really impactful for me. And it was something that was outside of my favorite field of reading horror stories, right? But most of the short fiction that I just named are things that either taught me something about writing short fiction, unreliable narrators, and in regards to Yellow Wallpaper, this woman's descent into madness that is firsthand, right? You get to read it firsthand, her descending into madness. And no one being able to assist, right? A very lonely, very gut-checking, very gut-wrenching story. So they taught me about how to write, how to use words to have a strong emotional impact. And so these are the stories. Man, I could spend all day talking about various short stories that have shaped me as a writer or have emotionally impacted me as a reader. But I'll stop because there's like 3 other people.
Jean Marie.
Well, I feel bad because I'm one of those people who remembers plot and character and sometimes authors and never ever titles. There was one story that blew me away because of where it hit in my life, and that was Cat Pictures, Please, which won a Hugo a few years ago. Very short story about an AI who was actually helping the world, and all it wanted for its efforts was cat pictures. But in terms of my development as a writer, all of the classics that we've all grown up with, De Maupassant, The Lady of the Tiger, The Necklace, any story by Poe, any story, even if they were mangled to death in Roger Corman movies. And then there's something that we don't talk about in terms of short stories, but a lot of poetry, you know, Think of the Raven is actually a short story set in verse. And things like The Highwayman were really very influential about my idea of how to tell a story. But the other things that were very influential were all of the short stories by Robert Irwin Howard. I know that's probably, you know, totally un-PC, but in my high school and college years, they opened up an entire world, you know, after years of hearing, you have to put away your mythology, you have to put away your fairy tales. You cannot write stories about things that didn't happen or couldn't happen. You know, fantasy, it's no, forget fantasy, it all has to be either science fiction or mainstream fiction or mystery or something like that. And it's like, and here is this whole world of fantasy that Howard and then people like Fritz Leiber opened up in their pulp short stories. And it was like, not just one in particular, but all of them together were so important to my reading and my vision of what could be done as a writer, as well as my future as a writer. That's all I got.
All right, Michele.
Oh my goodness. I guess I'll talk about what's influenced me in the last 10 years. The stories I'm going to say really challenged me around structure and thinking what's possible. So Happy Endings by Margaret Atwood. It starts out with John and Mary are in love, and then it gives you 6 different endings, and it plays with second person narration, third person narration, just does everything. And it's short, and it gives you 6 endings. And it's a meta commentary on love, and just beautifully done. I love Octavia Butler's short fiction, even though she's known for her novels, but I feel like I've learned a lot from looking at those. And there's a writer named Joy Castro who has this wonderful collection called When Winter Began, which is a retelling of it's a modern retelling of Persephone and the Persephone and Demeter myth, but setting it primarily with Latina mothers and daughters. And it's fantastic. And then one story that influenced me, I've forgotten the title. I think the title is just called Dogs, but it's by the author Kevin Conte. And it's told from the second person perspective. And I know, again, some people might be like, they hate second person perspective, but it's about this young man who works in an animal shelter where they kill dogs at the end of the day. And it takes you through, you know, he's telling you the story, and it's directly confronting the reader. And it is one of the most powerful things I've ever read, and made me want to, you know, write more short fiction and play with different viewpoints.
Great. And finally, Gail.
Well, I agree with a lot of the things that Jean Marie listed, Poe and many of those, all that, especially Poe. I always viewed fairy tales as short stories also, especially if you grew up with that series where it was like the pink book, the gray book, the yellow book. They were all different colored books of fairy tales from all over the world, which are essentially short stories. And then I think it was Tanya Huff who did a retelling of of fairy tales long before it was cool. That they all had a horror edge to them. So I remember in particular a retelling of the Little Red Riding Hood story where Grandma was the wolf. And that really struck me. I think that one of the short stories, and the collection of short stories, Destination Universe by A. Van Vo, was one of the books that pointed me toward writing fantasy and science fiction, because it kind of opened up that whole world and said, oh, wow, there is this really cool thing out there. But one of the other stories that just haunts me, and I keep coming back to it, is Bob Shaw's Light of Other Days. And it appeared in Analog back in 1966. It gets republished quite a bit and referenced quite a bit, but it's the slow glass story. And it's the story where the guy goes to talk to the farmer who grows this slow glass. And the farmer keeps looking into his house at his wife and son, and things are not as they appear. And it's just a very poignant story. And like I said, it kind of haunts me. It's just never gone away.
Okay, thank you so much. And let's go around and have everyone tell us where we can find you on social media. I'll start with Jean Marie.
Okay, you can find me on social media on Facebook or Twitter. In both, if you type in my name, you'll get to it. I'm at facebook.com /Jean Marie Ward /Jean Marie Ward Writer, and at Twitter, Jean _Marie _Ward. And I've got a website, jeanmarieward.com.
Okay. And Michele?
You can find me on Facebook, and I'm of 1L Michele, and that's Berger, Berger. And I also have a blog called The Practice of Creativity, where I do a lot of support for writers. And I also play on Twitter at Michele T. Berger.
Okay, Gail.
Website is gailzmartin.com. The Z is very important. There's other people, Gail Martin, I'm the one with the Z. Twitter is at Gail Z Martin. Morgan Bryce is morganbryce.com. And pretty much all of my other social media sites, Pinterest, Instagram, all of that is, if you put in Gail Z Martin, GZ Martin, or Morgan Bryce, you'll find me.
Okay, great. And finally, Nicole.
So on Facebook, I am, it's Facebook / Nicole Givens Kurtz. And on Twitter, it's at Nicole G. Kurtz. But pretty much if you put in Nicole Givens Kurtz, you'll get my website and all my social media platforms.
All right. I want to thank all of you for being here. And until next time in the panel room, thanks for watching.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Take care.